Last summer, Philando Castile was driving home with groceries. His girlfriend and his girlfriend's daughter were in the car when he was pulled over near a small town called Falcon Heights, Minnesota. The officer who stopped him thought he fit the description of a robbery suspect who had, quote, a wide-set nose.
Now, the accounts of what happened after that initial stop diverge. Officer Yanez says he opened fire on Castile because he thought Castile was reaching for his gun and he feared for his life. Castile's girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, started live streaming on Facebook almost immediately after those shots were fired. And here's some of that audio.
He's licensed. He's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm. We're waiting for a back. I will, sir. No worries. I will.
During the trial, Diamond Reynolds reiterated that Castile was reaching for his driver's license, not a gun. Regardless, the jury did not convict Officer Yanez. One juror, Bonita Schultz, said they just couldn't be sure if Castile was reaching for a gun or not.
We reached out to the police department in St. Anthony Village, that's where Officer Yanez worked, to talk about the outcome of the trial. They pointed us to a statement on the city's website that says, quote, the city of St. Anthony has concluded that the public will be best served if Officer Yanez is no longer a police officer in our city. The city intends to offer Officer Yanez a voluntary separation agreement to help him transition to another career other than being a St. Anthony officer.
Now, according to the statement, how that will all go down is still being negotiated.
I'm Reham Fashir. I'm a reporter with Minnesota Public Radio and a co-host of the 74 Seconds podcast.
74 seconds passed between the time Officer Yanez turned on his police lights to pull over Philando Castile and then fired 7 shots, killing him.
Reham Fashir's podcast examines that 74 seconds and everything that came after.
Reham, can you take us into the courtroom on the day the verdict was read? Take us into that moment.
I was sitting in the 4th row behind Officer Yanez and his family. So I was sitting on one side and the Castile family was sitting on the other side. So everything was quiet and the judge had ordered everyone to stay in their seat. No one was allowed to leave until the hearing was over. But as soon as Valerie Castile heard not guilty on the 3rd count, she got up and she yelled, F this, and got out of the courtroom. Everybody else followed her from that side. And then there were also a lot of emotions on the other side, on Yanez's side. The lawyers were hugging and congratulating the family. They were thanking them, and he was free to go after that. And then we ran into the Castile family outside giving their statement.
Did anyone find Yanez's family after the verdict, or did they try to?
Well, we tried to reach them, but no, we couldn't find them. They didn't want to say anything. They didn't want to comment.
What was the makeup of the jury like?
It was 12 people, 5 men and 7 women, and 2 of them are Black. One is an 18-year-old woman born in Ethiopia who came to the U.S. as a child, and the other one is an African-American man who identified himself as a millennial. Most of them aren't talking to us. One of them we caught up with afterwards, and he said that 2 of the jurors were leaning toward a guilty verdict, but we don't know which of the jurors were leaning towards that guilty verdict. But we do know, according to that juror, that it was not split along racial lines.
So what have the activists said that they're going to do now?
Well, they're planning more gatherings. There will likely be more protests. They promised more, but we don't know exactly what sort of gatherings are going to happen. There are community meetings happening around St. Paul and St. Anthony. So the conversations will continue. The conversations will continue to happen on what needs to change to improve police-community relations.
When we talk about community reaction, there's been a lot of talk in the news about the protesters. Has there been community reaction in support of the verdict?
Well, it's not as visible as the reaction we've seen from protesters, but at least I've seen social media posts supportive of Officer Yanez and his family. There was kind of a small campaign, a smaller campaign than the Philando campaign on social media called I Stand With 151, which is Officer Yanez's badge number.
One of the jurors said something about the way the law was written is what didn't allow them to convict the officer. And what does that mean, the way the law was written didn't allow them to convict this officer?
It's really complicated just because they had to consider a couple of different laws, even though the charges were the manslaughter law. But in a manslaughter case, culpable negligence is the deciding factor. So in Minnesota, state law justifies an officer's use of deadly force to protect the police officer or another from apparent death or great bodily harm. And then the manslaughter law says a person is culpably negligent if they create an unreasonable risk. So because state law gives officers discretion in the use of deadly force, some jurors can be reluctant to convict a police officer or even find them guilty of the other charge, which is the manslaughter law or the culpable negligence standard.
You are co-hosting this podcast, which has looked at what happened on July 2016, that traffic stop that ended with the death of Philando Castile and then the trial of Jeronimo Yanez. I mean, are you going to keep following the story?
Yeah, we're following the story. There is more to say. There are more angles to explore.
Which angles are there still to explore?
One issue that came up is the permit to carry a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So we're exploring that angle, what it's like for Black drivers who are gun owners and who are legally licensed to carry guns.
One of the things that was interesting about that element of the case was that this did not become a story about gun rights in a way that you might imagine another story in which a police officer shot someone who had legal paperwork that allowed them to carry a gun, in which they might rally around someone like that.
Right. We haven't heard a lot from the NRA about this case. We're also interested in exploring the use of force law to talk about when activists and when protesters are looking for prosecution and they're looking for police officers to be held accountable. But at the same time, if the use of force law and the laws are always going to be in the same language that they're written, then we just don't think that it'll be easy to make any change happen.
Are you saying that it's difficult to fix these things on the back end? Like you'd have to rethink the ways and the circumstances under which we allow police to use force to begin with?
That's exactly what I was trying to say, is that there are groups of people who are trying to lobby the legislature along with the pressure that's happening on the streets.